So we've got our wine tasting with Pete and Dave. And the first wine we've got here, Pete, is, how would you pronounce that?
Bacca Rosa, I would imagine.
That wine from Zonnen.
From our wines at Zonnen, her friends at Zonnen.
Right.
All the way from Italy.
This will be a sweet wine, won't it, Pete?
Sure will.
What do we get out of there first?
Well, interesting. You're almost getting like a blood orange sort of smell, like a Campari sort of smell. But
there is definitely fruit in there.
Yeah, but with that underlying element of sweet, sort of basically sweetness coming through, I guess.
I can actually get that sweetness on the bouquet.
Yeah, on the nose you pick up plenty of sweetness. There's no doubting the fact that this is intended to be fruity and sweet.
Well, just getting that on the palate is definitely sweet. Very sweet. Now, that isn't a natural sweetness, is it?
No. I think you've got to go to quite a bit of trouble to get that amount of sweetness into into a bubbly.
All right. The next wine we've got here is Australian Pinot Gris. Now, it says Pinot Grigio on the label.
Oh, right,
and I've had a lot of people say that Pinot Gris and Pinot Grigio are two different varieties.
Well, essentially it's the same variety. They're the same, but they're just using different names. The idea is that if it's labelled as Grigio, then it's going to be essentially Italianate in style. If it's labelled as Gris, it's going to be French in style, or more specifically from Alsace in France. And in theory, if it's Grigio, it should be crisp and clean and zingy and zesty, like a crisp, dry white sort of style. If it's Gris, if it's in the Alsace style, then it should be, I guess, more licoricey, bigger, richer, sort of more unctuous flavours. But this is pretty cheap and cheerful, I think, so we'd probably just expect a crisp, clean, zesty, dry white style.
2012 vintage?
Yeah. Well, that being Salisbury, I think that would be Riverland in South Australia, so it's made in Mildura. It comes from, Riverland fruit, which is the area where most of our bulk wine comes from in Australia. And I think you're basically looking for clean, fresh flavours, nothing too complicated.
Very subtle on the nose?
Yeah, there's not a lot happening there. It's, as I say, pretty crisp and clean, pretty dry. Even a bit grassy.
Seems to be a little bit of a sweetness on the palate in there.
Yeah. I mean, they want that to be, I guess, an omnibus style in a sense. They want it to appeal to a lot of different people, so a little bit of fruit sweetness, and you can get that quite easily. Just pick some of the grapes might be picked a little bit later. Also, bearing in mind that the Riverland area in South Australia is pretty warm, so you're getting ripe flavours quite easily in grapes that come from a warm area like that.
All right, the next wine we've got here is a Sauvignon Blanc. Now, this is Marlborough Sauvignon Blanc, but I was a little bit confused when I saw the label at first. It's a Warburn label, Warburn being Australian. So they would ship the Sauvignon Blanc over here from the Marlborough region, would they?
They would. And in fact, interestingly enough here, as we look on here, wine of New Zealand bottled in Australia.
Yes.
So therefore, what would generally happen in that case is that they pick the grapes, obviously, in New Zealand, and they process the juice, and they will ship the juice in tankers across the ditch, as they say. And Warburn Estate is based in the Riverina, as opposed to the Riverlands. The previous one, Salisbury, that's South Australian Riverlands, where our bulk wine comes from. This is Riverina around Griffith in New South Wales. But as befits a big player such as Warburn Estate, they can fetch their grapes from anywhere they like, and in this case they've worked out what everybody else has worked out, that people want Sauvignon Blanc from Marlborough in New Zealand, so they've got the juice in New Zealand, they've brought it all the way to Australia, and they've made it into wine.
I've got my nose in the glass already, and it's very, very, very typical New Zealand.
Yeah, it's typical of Marlborough. You get nettles and grasses and passion fruit, all those things combining.
There's almost a floral characteristic there too that I get in the nose.
Yeah, there's a lifted character which is very expressive, and it's what Marlborough Sauvignon Blanc does. That's why people recognise it, even without knowing what the wine is. If you give people a glass of Marlborough Sauvignon Blanc, then it shows up. The character in there is quite distinctive, and that's why it's so popular. And this one does those things.
Yep, definitely. On the palate, I definitely get that Marlborough Sauvignon Blanc, that passion fruit. I don't get quite as much acid on this one as I have in some previous vintages, this being 2012.
No, that's true. Yeah.
Very nice. I enjoyed that. Now, the next one we've got here is an Australian Bubbles. This one is the Dumont.
Dumont. As I understand it, the wine's made by the folks at Taltani in Victoria. And yeah, we've had quite a positive response to this from a lot of different people.
Traditional blend, the Pinot Chardonnay blend.
Yep.
Very zesty and very fruity on the nose.
Yeah, pretty typical of a well-made, I guess, commercial bubbly, but something that's pitched at a slightly higher end than your standard run-of-the-mill stuff. So they call it Prestige Cuvée, which simply means that it's an upmarket blend. You often see the word Cuvée on labels of sparkling wine, whether it be from Champagne in France or from other places, and if you see the word Cuvée, it really just means nothing more than blend, but presumably a superior blend, and I think it's got pretty good fruit in it.
Yeah, very fruity on the palate. I've just tried that, and I just get a little bit of the yeast sort of characteristic. It's not too dominating, but it isn't as buttery as some of the methods that I've tried, particularly from France.
No. It's not as rich, there's not as much of that autolysis character, the yeasty character, the sort of stuff that reminds you of a bread shop when you walk into the bakery and you smell that fresh bakery smells that you often get in some of the French champagnes, as opposed to just generic country wines that are made in France as well, but don't come from Champagne. Cangarilla Road.
Cangarilla Road. Yes, a glimmer of hope. Now this is a McLaren Vale Shiraz, 2011 vintage.
Okay, so interesting that we're looking at a wine from, I guess, in many ways, the maligned 2011 vintage. People have said that it's not as good a vintage as previous ones, and up to a point that's fairly true. It was cool and wet through most of the premium parts of South Australia. But I think also 2011 has suffered a little bit simply because the previous couple of vintages were so good, and so inevitably that's what wine does. It's an agricultural product, if you like, at its base, and so yeah, when the weather conditions are not quite so great, then it can be harder to get good wine.
Good fruit on the nose.
Yeah, having said that, McLaren Vale's pretty warm normally, and they should be able to get some pretty good fruit into this.
Yeah, good fruit on the nose. Nice fruit on the front of the palate.
Yeah. Probably doesn't carry through as much as you might like to think so, but pretty reasonable sort of flavour there. Just doesn't have the depth of flavour that you would have got from the previous couple of vintages. 2010 was the great vintage. 2009 pretty good as well. 11, I think we need to look at it, in terms of what it does in its own right. And they're making spicier, savoury sort of wines, probably for early drinking, and if we look at the wine in that context, then it works out okay.
Yeah, I get a little bit of cherry, a little bit of plum, but as you say, it's not real long on the palate.
Maybe not lots of hope, just a glimmer.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Okay, and we've got a McLaren Vale Chapel Hill.
Another McLaren Vale Shiraz, yeah.
Parson's Nose Shiraz, and yes, 2011.
Okay, so Chapel Hill, another quite well-known and quite well-regarded winery in South Australia. The first qualified head of winemaking as a female was employed at Chapel Hill. Pam Dunsford was her name, and she made her name at Chapel Hill. They do pretty good stuff there normally, big, rich, dense wines. And here's another one from the cooler 2011 vintage, but really good. You get a bit of that. Well, sometimes they talk about smash brick or chocolate characters on the nose, and you get a bit of that, I think, on the nose of this. Yeah,
this seems to have a little bit sort of darker fruit, maybe darker cherry and darker plum sort of characteristics.
Very much so, yeah.
Seems to be a little bit more structure there than the previous wine.
A bit more flesh on its bones, I think. A bit more flesh on the middle palate than what there was perhaps on the previous one.
Definitely.
So, yeah. But I mean, either of those would be good wines to drink with your, a bit of protein, a bit of slab of meat, a bit of steak on the barbie sort of thing would go well. Either of those wines would work pretty well. So what do we got?
Brands Lair Coonawarra, Cabernet Merlot, 2010.
Okay, now that's an interesting change of direction for two reasons. One of them obviously being that it's Cabernet, or Cabernet based, and the other one being that it's from Coonawarra, so the original classic Australian Cabernet region, and from a great vintage, 2010. The best vintage really in recent memory for most parts of the premium wine regions. And that's got classic Cabernet leafy sort of
Yes.
characters on the
I
nose.
was going to say the first thing that I picked out of the nose there is just a little bit of mintiness on the nose.
Yeah, but not. It's not a caricature. It's not exaggerated mint. There's mintiness there. It's what I would call typical or classical Coonawarra mint. It's there. You know it's mint, and you can pick up a minty character, but it's not subversive. It doesn't get in the way. It's not dominating at all.
Oh, that's lovely. Beautiful fruit. Beautiful fruit. Dark cherries. And I think the plum comes out of the Merlot part of that blend, but I get that in there. It's got a good middle palate.
Yeah.
And that seems to go on a little while, and there's some nice tannins in there as well.
Good length, yeah. Very, very supple tannin as well. Not aggressive tannin, but there's plenty of tannin there, but they're very supple, approachable tannin. So a very friendly wine to drink now, but something that would have the structure to keep for probably 10 years if you wanted to keep it. So yeah, pretty good drink that.
Great wine. And look at all the medals.
Yeah, well, I think when you try the wine afterwards, you can realise perhaps where the judges were coming from, and I imagine that'd be an easy wine to be seduced by. If you encountered that in a lineup, it'd be pretty easy to think I might just go back and try that one again.
Absolutely.
Very good. Excellent.
Thanks, Pete.
No problem. Thanks for that. We'll do it again soon.